On her wedding day, Sarah Matthews' loyal dog, Max, blocked her path. Then she discovered the heartbreaking reason why. Sarah stood before the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The ivory wedding dress she had dreamed of since she was a little girl hugged her figure perfectly, and her auburn hair cascaded in elegant waves beneath her veil. Everything was perfect, exactly as she had planned for the past 18 months. Well, almost everything. Her beloved German shepherd Max lay at her feet, his chin resting on his paws, amber eyes watching her every move. But there was something different about his gaze today. At 13 years old, Max had been her constant companion through high school, college, and now into adulthood. She had rescued him as a scrappy 8-month-old pup from the local shelter in their small Connecticut town, and in return, he had rescued her in more ways than she could count. "What do you think, buddy?" Sarah turned slightly, admiring how the lace detail of her dress caught the morning light, streaming through her bedroom window. "Is Michael a keeper?" At the mention of her fiancé's name, Max's ears twitched, but he remained unusually still. Typically, he would bound to his feet at any mention of Michael, whom he had grown to love over the past 3 years. But today something was off. Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, poked her head into the room. "Sweetheart, the makeup artist is here. Are you ready?" "Coming, Mom." Sarah gave herself one last look in the mirror before reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "Come on, boy. Let's go make me a bride." Max stood slowly, his joints creaking with age. A familiar pang tugged at Sarah's heart. He wasn't the sprightly young dog he used to be, but he was still her best friend. She had insisted he be part of the wedding ceremony, despite her mother's initial protests. Michael, understanding how much Max meant to her, had readily agreed. They had even gotten him a special collar with a tiny bow tie for the occasion. The next 2 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Bridesmaids in pale blue dresses fluttered around the house, hair and makeup artists worked their magic, and Sarah's mother clicked across the floor in her heels as she coordinated with the wedding planner. Through it all, Max stayed close, more subdued than usual. "Is he feeling okay?" Jenny, Sarah's maid of honor and best friend since middle school, asked as they prepared to leave for the church. "He seems a little off today." Sarah frowned slightly, running a hand along Max's back. "I think he's just picking up on all the excitement. You know how sensitive he can be." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Max had been different the past few days, eating less, moving more slowly, and sleeping longer. She had meant to take him to the vet, but with all the last-minute wedding preparations— "We should get going," Elizabeth announced, checking her watch. "The photographer wants to get some shots before the ceremony, and traffic might be heavy." Sarah nodded, gathering her skirts. "Come on, Max, time to go." The short drive to St. Patrick's Church felt longer than it should have. But it wasn't wedding jitters making Sarah's stomach twist. She had no doubts about Michael. No, this unease was something else, something deeper. She glanced down at Max, who rested his head on her lap, unusually clingy. When they arrived at the church, the photographer was already setting up in the garden, taking advantage of the perfect late September weather. Golden sunlight filtered through the changing leaves, casting a dreamy glow over the scene, exactly what Sarah had envisioned. "Let's get some shots of the bride alone first," the photographer suggested, positioning Sarah near a beautiful old oak tree. "Then we'll bring in the wedding party." Max, who had been sitting quietly beside Sarah's father, suddenly stood up. Before anyone could react, he walked over to Sarah and planted himself firmly in front of her, blocking the photographer's view. "Max, move aside, buddy," Sarah said gently, trying to guide him away. But Max wouldn't budge. He wasn't growling or showing any signs of aggression. He simply stood there, pressing his body against her legs, looking up at her with those soulful eyes. "Max, come here, boy." Sarah's father patted his leg. Nothing. "Maybe he needs a walk," Jenny suggested, reaching for his leash. But when she stepped forward, Max only pressed closer to Sarah, nearly knocking her off balance. "Max, what's wrong?" Sarah knelt down, wedding dress and all, to look into his eyes. And that's when she noticed it. His breathing was labored, his legs trembled, and beneath her touch his body was too warm. "Sarah, we need to get these photos done," her mother said, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. "The guests will be arriving soon." But Sarah barely heard her. All she could focus on was Max, who had now rested his head on her shoulder, something he only did when he wasn't feeling well and needed comfort. Her heart clenched. "Something's wrong," she whispered, voice cracking. "He's not okay." Jenny knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on Max's side. "His heart is racing." Sarah's father stepped closer, concern etching his features. "Should we call the vet?" "The wedding," Elizabeth began, then fell silent at the look on her daughter's face. Sarah was already pulling out her phone, dialing Dr. Peterson, Max's longtime vet. Her hand shook as she pressed the phone to her ear. "This is Kate speaking. Dr. Peterson's emergency line." "Kate, it's Sarah Matthews. Something's wrong with Max. He's having trouble breathing, his heart is racing, and he's acting really strange. Please, I need help." A pause. "Sarah, aren't you getting married today?" "Yes, but—" Her voice caught. "Please, bring him in right away. Dr. Peterson is here doing paperwork. He'll see Max immediately." Sarah looked up at the small crowd gathered around her, her parents, Jenny, the photographer, the wedding planner now whispering into her headset. Then, finally, she met her father's gaze. "Go," he said firmly. "I'll call Michael and explain. Jenny can drive you." "But the wedding—" Her father stepped forward, voice resolute. "Sarah, that dog has been by your side through everything. Your first heartbreak, college finals, your grandmother's passing. He was there when you met Michael, and he's been with you every step of the way. You don't abandon family when they need you." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she hugged him tightly. "Thank you." Everything after that moved in a blur. Jenny helped Sarah gather her skirts, leading her toward the car, while Max followed, still pressing against her legs whenever possible. Sarah's mother, after a moment's hesitation, jumped into action, handling the guests, instructing the wedding planner to contact the reception venue. The drive to the veterinary clinic was tense. Sarah sat in the back seat, Max's head resting in her lap, her wedding dress pooling around them like a cloud. She kept one hand on his chest, monitoring his breathing, while the other stroked his graying muzzle. "Remember when you first got him?" Jenny asked softly, trying to distract her. He was such a handful. Despite her worry, Sarah managed a small smile. "He ate my favorite shoes the first week. And your mom's garden gloves. And that awful hat my aunt gave me for Christmas. The one with the plastic fruit on it?" Jenny laughed. "He did you a favor there." Sarah let out a shaky breath, hugging Max closer. But deep down she knew something was very, very wrong. "Enthusiastically, we've been making some calls," the minister said. "He'd be happy to come here. Your parents are on board. It wouldn't be the wedding you planned, but we could get married here." Sarah looked around the examination room, then down at Max, who was watching her with those same loving eyes that had won her heart 13 years ago. "Really?" "Only if you want to," Michael said. "We can also wait, reschedule everything." "No," Sarah interrupted, a watery smile spreading across her face. "This is perfect. Max has been there for every important moment in our relationship. He was there when we met at the park, there for our first date, there when you proposed. He should be here for this too." And so, 2 hours later, Sarah Matthews married Michael Anderson in the waiting room of Riverside Veterinary Clinic. Her dress was wrinkled, her makeup hastily repaired by Jenny, her hair falling in natural waves around her shoulders. Michael's tuxedo was slightly rumpled from sitting on the floor. Their parents, the minister, Jenny, and Kevin, were the only guests. Max, wearing his bow-tie collar and sporting a new 4-paw print on his leg, lay contentedly at their feet as they exchanged their vows. Dr. Peterson and his staff watched from the doorway, discreetly wiping away tears as the minister pronounced them husband and wife. When Michael kissed the bride, Max managed to lift his head and give a single quiet woof of approval, making everyone laugh through their tears. That evening, instead of dancing at their reception, Sarah and Michael sat on the floor of their apartment with Max between them, sharing take-out Chinese food while still in their wedding clothes. They took turns feeding him small bites of plain chicken that Dr. Peterson had approved. "You know," Michael said, watching as Max gently took a piece of chicken from Sarah's fingers, "when I first met you two at the park that day, I knew Max was part of the package deal. I just didn't realize he'd end up teaching me so much about love." Sarah looked at her new husband curiously. "What do you mean?" "Well, look at today. You had this perfect wedding planned, everything exactly the way you dreamed it. But the moment Max needed you, none of that mattered. You didn't even hesitate. That's real love, the kind that doesn't count the cost, that shows up no matter what, the kind I want our marriage to be built on." Sarah leaned over to kiss him, careful not to disturb Max, who had drifted off to sleep between them. "When did you get so wise?" Michael smiled, nodding at Max. "I learned from the best. He's been showing us how to love unconditionally all along." The months that followed were both precious and difficult. Max had good days and bad days. The medications helped, but they couldn't stop the inevitable progression of his condition. Sarah and Michael adjusted their lives around his needs, taking turns staying home with him when he was too tired to be alone, celebrating the good days with short walks in the park where they had first met, and comforting him through the harder ones. Through it all, Max maintained his gentle, loving spirit. He still greeted them at the door when they came home, even if he could only wag his tail instead of jumping up. He still insisted on sleeping next to their bed, still begged for treats with those soulful eyes, and still showed his love in countless small ways. On a quiet evening in early spring, almost 6 months after the wedding, Max let them know it was time. He'd had a good day, eaten well, enjoyed some sunshine in the backyard, even played gently with his favorite toy. But as night fell, he became restless, moving from Sarah to Michael and back again, as if making sure they were both there. They called Dr. Peterson, who came to the house. In their living room, with Max's head cradled in Sarah's lap and Michael's strong hand stroking his back, they said goodbye to the faithful friend who had given them so much. "Thank you," Sarah whispered in Max's ear as he drifted peacefully away. "Thank you for everything, for being my protector, my friend, for leading me to Michael, for teaching us what love really means. And thank you for choosing me all those years ago at the shelter." Later that night, as they looked through photos from their unconventional wedding day, Sarah paused on one that Jenny had captured without them noticing. In it, Sarah and Michael were exchanging their vows, but they weren't looking at each other or the minister. Instead, they were both looking down at Max, who was gazing up at them with pure love in his eyes. "He knew," Sarah said softly, tracing Max's image with her finger. "That day at the clinic, when he wouldn't let me walk down the aisle, he knew he was running out of time, and he wanted to make sure we understood what really mattered." Michael wrapped his arms around her. He succeeded. Our wedding day wasn't perfect in the traditional sense, but it was perfect for us. Because of Max, we started our marriage focused on what truly matters: love, commitment, and being there for each other, no matter what. A year later, Sarah and Michael stood in front of the Riverside Animal Shelter, the same shelter where Sarah had found Max 13 years earlier. They'd spent months grieving Max's loss, but now they felt ready to open their hearts again. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked gently, squeezing Sarah's hand. Sarah nodded, touching the locket around her neck that contained a small photo of Max. "He taught us so much about love. The best way to honor his memory is to share that love with another dog who needs a home." Inside, they were greeted by the familiar sounds and smells of a shelter. As they walked past the kennels, Sarah couldn't help but remember the day she'd first seen Max. A skinny, scared German Shepherd puppy who'd stolen her heart with one look from those soulful eyes. At the end of one row, they stopped in front of the last kennel. A senior golden retriever lay on a worn blanket, gray around the muzzle, watching them with gentle brown eyes. The name card read, Duke, age 10. Most people want puppies or young dogs, the shelter worker explained, noticing their interest. Duke's been here for 3 months. His family had to surrender him when they moved into a nursing facility. He's sweet as can be, but his age puts people off. Sarah knelt by the kennel door. Duke lifted his head, then slowly got to his feet and walked over to her. Through the gate, he pressed his nose against her hand. "He has arthritis in his back legs," the worker continued. "He'll need medication and probably won't be up for long walks." "But he's perfect," Sarah interrupted, looking up at Michael with tears in her eyes. Michael nodded, understanding completely. That evening, Duke settled into their home as if he'd always been there. He found Max's old bed by the fireplace and made it his own. As Sarah and Michael cuddled on the couch, watching Duke sleep peacefully in Max's old spot, Sarah said, "Some people thought we were crazy to adopt a senior dog, knowing we'd have less time with him." Michael smiled, pulling her closer. "But we know better, don't we? Max taught us that it's not about the quantity of time, it's about the quality of love." And thanks to Max, they had learned that love, in all its forms, was always worth embracing, no matter how much time they had together.